She was closing her Boston Café when the city's most feared mafia boss sat down and said one last coffee. But this is not just a story about danger walking through a locked door. It is about what happens when the one person who terrifies the world looks at you like you are the only safe place he has left. If you have ever held your life together with tired hands, smiled through grief, or felt your heart reach for something it had no right to want, this story will hit deeper than you expect. You will step into rain-slick streets, midnight silence, and a small coffee shop where one choice changes everything. Stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. If this opening pulls you in, leave a like, and let's begin. And that was how it started. Not with a confession, not with a gunshot, not with the kind of grand entrance people later liked to imagine when they whispered his name. It started with rain on a glass door, a chipped blue mug, and a man who looked like he had stepped out of the worst part of the night just to ask for something warm. By morning, Boston had already moved on. The South End was loud again. Delivery vans clogged the narrow streets. Pedestrians hurried past brick row houses with collars turned up against the wind. Somewhere nearby, a siren cut through traffic, then faded into the ordinary pulse of the city. Inside. Brook Street Coffee. The grinders screamed milk, hissed into foam, and the front door kept opening and closing under the soft brass bell Lena had polished so many times she could have done it blind. But even with the line building toward the pastry case and the register spitting receipts one after another, she could still hear his voice. One last coffee. She had slept badly, drifting in and out of shallow dreams, where someone knocked at the door but never came inside. When she caught her reflection in the pastry case glass, she barely recognized herself. Her face looked tired in a new way, not from work, not from bills, not from the ordinary grind of keeping a small family business alive. This was a sharper kind of unrest, like her instincts had seen something in the dark and were still trying to decide whether to run from it or reach for it. "You are somewhere else today." Ivy set a tray of cranberry scones into the display and gave Lena the kind of look only younger sisters could give, all suspicion sharpened by affection. At 17, Ivy had grown into that dangerous age where she could read Lena too easily and ask the exact question Lena wanted to avoid. "I am right here," Lena said, wiping down the espresso machine. "Your body is right here. Your mind is in witness protection." That pulled the corner of Lena's mouth up in spite of herself. "Finish labeling the muffins." Ivy leaned closer over the counter. "Did something happen last night?" "Number. You always say no that fast when the answer is yes." Lena reached for a stack of paper cups she did not need to straighten. "We closed late, that is all." Ivy watched her for a second longer, then lifted one shoulder and returned to the pastry case. But Lena knew that look. It meant Ivy was not convinced. It also meant Lena would hear about it again if she gave her the slightest opening. By noon, the rush thinned. The windows were fogged from warmth inside and cold pressing in from the street. Mr. Delaney sat in his usual corner with black coffee and a folded newspaper he never seemed to finish. A pair of students argued over a shared banana bread. 2 nurses in scrubs came in for lattes and took them to go. Lena was refilling sugar jars when the television mounted above the menu board cut from a weather update to local news. She almost ignored it. The sound was low, and the screen rarely held anything that mattered more than the life right in front of her. But one name made the whole room shift around her. Dominic Russo. The anchor's voice sharpened as footage rolled across the screen. Black SUVs, camera flashes. A crowd straining against barricades. Men in dark coats moving with practiced alertness. And then him. The man from last night stepped out of the rear door of one of the SUVs, one hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve as if the chaos around him did not belong to him at all. In daylight, framed by reporters and city noise, he looked even less human than he had in her cafe. Not because he was cruel, because he seemed carved out of something harder than ordinary men. His expression gave nothing away. His eyes stayed cool. No one touched him. No one blocked his path. The crowd moved around him like water splitting around stone. Below the footage ran a caption naming him as the rumored head of the Russo organization. A man tied for years to racketeering, extortion, gambling, labor control, and enough whispered violence to keep his reputation alive, even when he vanished from public view. The rag in Lena's hand slipped to the floor. Ivy looked up. Lena. Lena's mouth had gone dry. She stared at the screen as if staring long enough would change the face on it. It did not. Same eyes. Same bruised knuckles. Same calm voice. Same impossible stillness. Only now the truth stood around him like armed men. Mr. Delaney folded his paper with a soft crackle and glanced at the television. That city has had his kind for longer than it cares to admit. The students near the window had turned too. No way, that is actually Dominic Russo. That is him. I saw his picture online last month. Looks like a movie star if movie stars were terrifying. Lena bent to pick up the rag before anyone could see her hands trembling. She wrung it out harder than necessary, feeling the cold sink into her fingers. He came in here, her mind whispered, though she would never say it aloud. He sat by the window. He drank from a chipped mug. He told her honest coffee was better than perfect coffee. She should have been horrified. Instead, what unsettled her most was how little the news footage changed the memory of him in that chair. That night she closed early. Not officially. The sign stayed lit until regular time. The last customer still got a smile and a fresh pour, and the till still got counted down to the cent. But every motion carried tension under it. She checked the front lock twice after the final customer left. Then 3 times. She turned the chairs upside down on the tables. She wiped the pastry case glass until it reflected her face back in tired amber. At 10 minutes to midnight, she turned off the pendant lights over the front windows and left only the warmer lights on near the counter. The cafe looked smaller that way, less visible from the street tucked into itself like a secret. "Are you trying to hide the building?" Ivy asked, pulling on her coat. "I want to get home." Ivy narrowed her eyes. "You really are acting weird." Lena forced a shrug. "Go upstairs. Finish your homework." Their apartment sat above the cafe, the old arrangement passed down from their parents. It had never made them rich, but it kept the world small enough to manage. Ivy lingered halfway to the back stairs. "If something is wrong, you tell me." Lena softened. "Nothing is wrong." It was a lie, though not the kind Ivy could easily prove. When Ivy disappeared upstairs, the silence settled in. The clock on the wall read 11:57. Lena told herself she would not open the door if he came. 11:58. She told herself that men like Dominic Russo were storms. You did not invite storms in just because they asked politely. 11:59. The city outside seemed to pause with her. A bus rolled through the intersection and vanished. Wind dragged loose rainwater along the curb. The sign in the window hummed softly. The blue light of Brooks Street Coffee reflected faintly on the wet sidewalk. Then came 3 soft knocks. Her pulse stumbled. He had not knocked like a stranger desperate to be let in. He had knocked like a man returning to a place he had already decided mattered. Lena stood perfectly still, staring at the glass. He was there, in the dark coat again, shoulders broad beneath the streetlight, one hand in his pocket, the other down at his side. No bodyguards visible. No car at the curb. Just him, and the rain faded into mist around him. She walked to the door slower than she wanted to. When she reached it, she did not unlock it right away. "We are closed," she said through the glass. His mouth moved slightly, almost a smile, almost not. "You said that last night, too. And you ignored me last night, too. I listened. I just hoped you would reconsider." The answer should not have warmed her. Somehow it did. She cracked the door open a few inches, leaving the chain on. "Do you do this often? Drink coffee after midnight? No, show up where you're not supposed to." His gaze met hers through the narrow opening. Up close, the bruise along his jaw looked darker than the night before. A small cut nicked his lower lip, too neat to be accidental. "Only when I keep thinking about the coffee. You have people to buy coffee for you." "I do. And still you are here." "Yes." There was no performance in it. No charm laid on thick. Just that same calm certainty that made refusal feel flimsy. Lena should have shut the door. Instead, she slid the chain free. The bell chimed softly as he stepped inside, bringing cold air with him. Tonight, he removed his gloves before sitting down, folding them with precise movements on the table near the window. Lena stayed behind the counter, putting distance between them while her nerves sorted themselves out. What is it tonight? Whatever you made last time. That is not an order. You seem to understand it. Her hands moved before her thoughts did. Grinder, scoop, press, steam lifting against the warm light. She knew the rhythm so well she did not have to look down. Still, she felt his attention on her, steady and unreadable, as if he were watching something much more important than a woman making coffee in a nearly empty shop. When she set the mug in front of him, he glanced at the chips on the rim and then at her. "You always serve customers in this one." "No," she said. His fingers wrapped around the mug. Should I be honored or insulted? Neither. It was close. That earned the faintest real smile. It changed his whole face for 1 second, not softening it so much as revealing how rare softness must be in his life. He took a sip, closed his eyes briefly, exhaled. "Still honest," he murmured. Lena folded her arms. "I saw the news." He looked back at her over the steam. "I assumed you would. You should have told me who you were. You did not ask. I should not have had to." He set the mug down gently. "Does it change the coffee?" "Number. Then maybe it only changes what you think you know about me." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it short and disbelieving. That sounds like the kind of thing a dangerous man says when he wants people to ignore the dangerous part. His gaze did not waver. "No, it sounds like the truth." That silence between them was different from the night before. Sharper. More aware of itself. Lena had spent all day trying to fit the man from the television into the memory of the man sitting here. She still had not managed it. "People are afraid of you," she said. "Yes. Should I be?" He did not answer immediately. Outside, headlights swept past the windows and then disappeared. The cafe filled with the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant rattle of the heater kicking on. Finally, he said, "Probably." It would have been easier if he had lied. Easier if he had told her she had nothing to fear, that his world stopped neatly at the threshold, that men like him could sit quietly in warm rooms and leave no shadows behind. But he did not. He just let the truth sit between them, heavy and unadorned. Lena leaned one hip against the counter. "Then, why are you here?" Something shifted in his expression, small but real. Not surprise. Recognition, maybe. As if she had finally asked the question worth answering. "Because he said for an hour last night no one wanted anything from me except whether I took sugar." She looked at him for a long moment. And I liked that. She did not know what to do with the sudden quiet ache that moved through her at that answer. So instead of pushing further, she reached for a towel and wiped down the same already clean section of counter she had wiped all night. He watched her do it and said very quietly, "You do that when you are nervous." Her head snapped up. "You notice too much. That makes two of us." Against her better judgment, her mouth curved. He stayed 25 minutes. Not long enough to become safe. Long enough to become familiar. When he rose to leave, he pulled a bill from his wallet and set it on the table. Lena glanced at it and frowned. "This is too much." "Then keep the difference for my next cup." "There should not be a next cup, but there will be." He spoke as if he were stating the weather. At the door, his hand paused on the brass handle. "Lock it as soon as I leave." She crossed her arms. "You said that last night." "I meant it last night, too." The irritation in her face must have shown because something like amusement moved through him. "You think you are invisible in this city," he said. "Small place, long hours, good coffee, quiet life. That kind of life makes people careless about what watches them." The room seemed to cool. "Are you threatening me?" His whole face changed at that. Not anger exactly. Something harder offended in a dark and private place. "Number." Then he stepped out into the night. Lena locked the door behind him and stood there with her hand still on the bolt, listening to his footsteps fade. The next morning she told herself that would be the end of it. It was not. He came back 2 nights later, then again the night after that. Never earlier than closing. Never loud, never with an entourage. Sometimes he wore a dark wool coat, damp from the mist off the harbor. Sometimes he came without it, suit jacket slung over one shoulder, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms, the line of old scars visible when he reached for the cup. He always sat by the window. He always took the same mug. And slowly, against every instinct Lena possessed, their conversations began to widen. He asked about the framed photographs behind the register, and she told him the cafe had belonged to her parents before the accident on the Interstate 3 winters ago. He did not offer cheap sympathy. He only looked at the pictures longer than most customers did, taking in the smiling man holding an overfull carafe and the woman laughing behind the counter with flour on her cheek. He asked how old Ivy was. He asked whether the bakery down the block still closed too early on Sundays. He asked what time the flower stand on Tremont set out fresh peonies in spring. Questions no one with his reputation should have bothered to ask. Questions that made him seem less like a headline and more like a man who had spent too long moving through rooms where no one answered honestly. In return, she learned the shape of his silences. If a car idled too long outside, his hand would go still around the mug. If footsteps slowed at the window, his eyes would lift sharp as a blade sliding free. If the conversation drifted too near his family or business, a wall came down so smoothly most people would never have noticed it. Most people, Lena realized, did not spend their lives watching small changes. She did. She had learned to read her mother's smile when the bills were overdue. Her father's shoulders when the plumbing needed repairs they could not afford. Ivy's expression on the anniversary of the accident when the grief came in too hard and too sudden. She knew what strain looked like. She knew what loneliness did to a person's face. And sometimes, late at night when Dominic held the warm mug between both hands and stared into the dark reflection of the coffee, he looked lonelier than anyone she had ever seen. That was what truly unsettled her. Not that he was dangerous. That he looked tired enough to stop being. The whispers began before the week was over. A pair of law students came in for cold brew, and one of them glanced toward the window table where Dominic had sat the night before. "My brother swears he saw Russo here after midnight." Mr. Delaney gave Lena a long look over the top of his newspaper. "You want an old man's advice?" She was steaming milk but heard the tone and sighed inwardly. "Probably not. You should take it anyway. Men with that kind of shadow do not visit bright places for no reason." Lena set the pitcher down. "Maybe he likes the coffee." Mr. Delaney stirred his cup with maddening patience. "Maybe he likes something else." Heat climbed the back of her neck. "You are reading too much into it." The old man smiled into his coffee. "At my age, all I have left is reading too much into things." Ivy caught her later after the lunch rush when the front tables were empty and rain gathered in silver beads on the window. "It is him, right?" Lena did not need to ask who she meant. "You should be doing homework." Ivy folded her arms. "You are deflecting." "I am working." The guy from the news. Lena lined up clean saucers in a perfect row. He came by for coffee. "That is all." Ivy stared at her, searching her face. "People do not come by for coffee looking like that." Looking like what? Like trouble. The word sat in the middle of the room. Lena wanted to dismiss it. Wanted to tell her sister not to be dramatic, not to make stories where there were only late nights and a regular customer with too much money and a face people feared. But the lie would not settle on her tongue, because Ivy was right. Trouble had a way of announcing itself before it struck. Sometimes it arrived loud. Sometimes it came softly in a good suit with rain on its shoulders and perfect manners. That night, long after Ivy went upstairs, Lena stood alone behind the counter and looked at the chair by the window. Empty. She should have felt relieved. Instead, some restless part of her listened for the door. The bell did not ring. Midnight passed. She laughed at herself once, quietly embarrassed by the hollowness that followed. Then at 12:12 the knock came. She crossed the room too fast and hated that he would know it. When she opened the door, Dominic took in one look at her face and said, "You thought I was not coming. I was not thinking about you at all." A pause. Then, "Of course. There was rain in his hair tonight." and a fresh scrape over his knuckles. He caught her looking. "It is nothing." "Funny," she said, stepping aside. "That is exactly what people say when it is not." He entered, and the room changed around him the way it always did now, as if his presence bent the edges of things. But tonight there was something else, too. A fatigue in the set of his shoulders, a hardness under his calm. She made the coffee without asking. He sat at the window and wrapped both hands around the mug. "You know," he said, "most people become less polite once they know who I am. Maybe I was never that polite." That earned a low sound that might have been a laugh. Outside, the rain thickened against the glass. Inside, the lights turned everything gold. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Then, Lena said softly enough that she almost took it back. "Do you ever get tired of everyone being afraid of you?" He looked up at her. The answer, when it came, was so quiet she had to lean in to hear it. Yes. And for the first time since he had stepped into her cafe, she felt something stranger than fear pass between them. Recognition. She did not know it yet, not fully. She only knew that the room had gone very still, and the city outside sounded farther away than it should have, and that somewhere between the first knock and this one, the story had stopped belonging only to danger, and started belonging to something more difficult to outrun. At midnight, with the rain tracing silver lines down the windows and the coffee gone warm between his hands, Lena found herself no longer listening for whether he would knock, but for what would happen inside her when he did. The question frightened her more than anything she knew about him. For the next few nights, Boston settled into a damp April rhythm. Rain came and went. The sidewalks stayed slick. The city exhaled steam from subway grates, and restaurant vents and Brook Street coffee kept doing what it had always done. It opened at 6. It sold too many oat milk lattes to students who looked half awake, and not enough black coffee to men who still carried newspapers folded under one arm. It smelled like cinnamon toasted sugar and roasted beans, and for most people who crossed its threshold, that was all it was. For Lena, the place had begun to split in two. By day, it was the cafe her parents built and left in her hands. The register stuck if she hit the keys too hard. The refrigerator in back rattled every 20 minutes like it had a grudge against the modern world. The front window still had a tiny crack at the bottom corner from the winter. A delivery driver backed into the curb and swore he had barely touched the glass. It was real in every possible way. It demanded money, effort, patience, and hours of standing until her spine ached. By night, it became something stranger. After the last table was wiped and the final chair turned upside down when the sign in the window cast its blue glow across the wet street, the cafe seemed to pull inward and hold its breath. The sounds changed. Every cup placed on the counter sounded clearer. Every footstep on the old wood floor carried farther. The city outside dimmed to the scrape of tires on pavement and the hiss of rain against brick. And then on the nights he came, there was the knock. 3 soft taps. Always the same. It became a rhythm she started hearing before it happened. In the last few minutes before midnight, when the clock crept toward the hour and the room settled into stillness, her hands would begin to betray her. She would straighten sugar packets that did not need straightening. Wipe down the same dry patch of counter twice. Check the milk fridge, then check it again without remembering why she opened it the first time. She told herself it was nerves. She knew it was anticipation. Dominic never arrived in the same coat twice, but he always carried the same air with him, like the street belonged to ordinary people until he stepped onto it. Sometimes there was rain on his shoulders. Sometimes the collar of his shirt sat open at the throat, revealing the edge of a silver chain. Once his right hand was wrapped in clean white gauze, he did not bother to explain. Another night, there was a faint purple shadow beneath one eye, and Lena hated how quickly she noticed. He always chose the window table. He always took the chipped blue mug. He never once asked for anything else. Their conversations began in fragments, the kind people could dismiss if they overheard only pieces. How late do you usually stay open? Too late. Does your sister always leave the radio on upstairs? Only when she wants me to know she is still awake. Who taught you to draw leaves like that on the chalkboard? My mother. Nothing dangerous in any of it. Nothing that belonged on a front page. But the fragments added up. Night after night, the distance between them shifted by inches, then by breaths. Lena learned that Dominic drank coffee too hot and never flinched, that he never touched the sugar jar, that his gaze moved to the door every single time someone slowed on the sidewalk outside, even if he kept talking, that sometimes he answered a question with the truth, and sometimes he answered with silence so complete it became its own kind of warning. He learned that Lena kept a pencil tucked behind her ear when she was tired and forgot it was there, that she tapped the side of a mug with her thumbnail when she was thinking, that she still counted the register in her head before checking the final number on the screen because her father used to say trusting machines too quickly was how people lost money. Some nights he asked about her parents, not carelessly, not with polite sorrow. He asked the way a man handled glass when he knew exactly how sharp it could be. The first time Lena was grinding beans. She did not look up when he said the photographs behind the register. You look like your mother. She kept her hand on the metal scoop longer than necessary. People say that. He watched her for a moment. Did she love this place as much as you do? Lena gave a quiet laugh. More probably. My father loved the idea of it. My mother loved every little thing that made it work. She remembered how every regular took their coffee. She knew when the pastry supplier was lying. She could look at a broken espresso machine and tell whether it needed repairs or just a better attitude. Dominic glanced toward the old machine as if considering the possibility that it did in fact have an attitude. And your father. He talked strangers into staying 5 minutes longer than they planned and leaving $20 happier than they came in. The smile that touched her mouth faded as quickly as it appeared. The accident happened on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were inventory nights. My father hated doing inventory. He always stopped at that gas station off the interstate and bought those terrible powdered donuts no one else in the house would eat. She stopped there. The grinder had already finished. The silence that followed was not empty. It held the shape of all the things she rarely let herself say aloud. Dominic did not offer sympathy. He did not say he was sorry in the thin, useless way people said it when they wanted grief to move along so everyone could feel more comfortable. He only asked, "How old were you?" 22. And Ivy? 14. He looked into the steam rising from the mug. Too young. The words were simple, but something in his voice made them land differently. Not as pity, as recognition. Lena set the fresh coffee in front of him. You say that like you know. He was quiet, long enough that she assumed he would let the question fall. Then he said, my mother died when I was 16. She stilled. It was the first thing he had told her about himself that was not carefully stripped of personal meaning. What happened? He did not answer right away. His hand rested along the handle of the mug thumb, moving once over the worn ceramic as though the chipped edge kept him tethered to the room. Cancer, he said at last, slow enough to be cruel, fast enough to leave nothing unsaid. Lena leaned one hip against the counter, not trusting herself to sit down. And your father. A humorless smile touched his mouth. My father believed grief should be handled in private, and weakness should not be repeated. Is that why you do this? His eyes lifted to hers. Do what? Come here after midnight and drink coffee like it is the only quiet thing left in the world. For the first time since she had met him, he looked briefly caught off guard. Not exposed exactly. Not a man who could be cornered. But a man who had not expected anyone to name the truth before he could hide it. Yes, he said. The answer moved through her more deeply than she wanted. After that, the nights changed. Not all at once. There was no clean moment where caution ended and trust began. But the edges softened. He stayed longer. She stopped pretending she was about to send him away. He let his guard slip in narrow, dangerous ways the way a man in deep water might loosen his grip on the surface because he had found one thing solid enough to hold. One night, Lena was sketching again after close not because she meant to, but because her hand had missed it. There was always scrap paper near the register, delivery receipts, supplier invoices, notes about damaged syrup bottles or milk orders. She turned one over and found herself drawing without thinking. First, the shape of the mug, then a hand around it, then the line of a wrist disappearing into the dark fold of a sleeve. She only realized what she had done when a shadow fell across the paper. Dominic stood on the other side of the counter. He did not ask permission before picking it up. Her pulse kicked hard as she reached for it, but his fingers closed over the page first. "It is unfinished," she said too quickly. He ignored that. The cafe went quiet in the oddest way. Even the low hum of the refrigerator seemed to pull back. The drawing was rough, only pencil lines and suggestions of shadow, but it was unmistakably him. The angle of his hand, the stillness in his posture, the strange weight he carried even in rest. He studied it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You made me look tired." "You were." Past tense. She folded her arms to stop herself from trying to grab the page again. "You also look like a man who has not trusted a full night of sleep in years." That faint, almost smile appeared. "You are very generous." "It is not generous. It is observational." His gaze returned to the drawing. "Most people make me look cruel." The honesty in that sentence struck her somewhere tender. "That is because most people are trying to capture what they fear. And you," Lena swallowed. "I drew what I saw." He let those words settle between them. Then, with surprising care, he laid the page flat on the counter instead of keeping it. "What did you see?" She should have lied. A joke would have been easier. Something careless and bright and safe. But the hour had stripped too much from the room already. A man who looks like he forgot how to set anything down. For a second, he did not move at all. Then he placed both hands on the counter and lowered his head very slightly, as if her answer had found the exact bruise she had not known how to name. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "My father raised me to believe power was the only thing worth carrying." Lena stayed where she was. "He said men survived by being feared first and understood never. He called mercy a liability. He called softness an opening." By the time I was old enough to know he was wrong, half the city already believed his name was law. She held her breath, sensing that any movement would break whatever had loosened inside him. When he died, Dominic continued. Everything became mine. The businesses, the debt, the loyalty, the violence. Men who had followed him their whole lives looked at me and waited to see if I would become him. "And did you—" The question came out softer than she intended. His jaw shifted once. "Some nights I think so." A rush of cold went through her. Not because he sounded proud. Because he sounded tired of the answer. The rain had started again outside, light at first, ticking against the window glass. Lena moved around the counter before she had fully decided to. She stopped across from him, close enough now to see the faint line of a scar near his temple, pale beneath dark hair. "What would happen," she asked, "if you walked away?" He gave a low laugh that carried no humor. "Men like me do not walk away. They vanish or they are buried." Something in her face must have changed, because his expression softened by a degree. "That is why this place matters," he said. The words landed harder than any flirtation could have. She looked around the cafe as if seeing it through his eyes. The chalkboard menu written in her rounded lettering. The pastry case with only 2 croissants left. The old tile floor her parents meant to replace but never did. The little basil plant by the register that refused to die even in poor light. "This place is small," she said. "That is not the same as unimportant." The room was too warm suddenly. Or maybe her skin had just become too aware of the space between them. Dominic glanced toward the front windows. Across the street, beneath the street lamp near the bookstore, a man stood smoking. He had not been there a minute ago. Or maybe he had, and Lena only now noticed because Dominic did. Every line in Dominic's body changed. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not stand. Yet the shift was immediate, unmistakable. The quiet man with the tired eyes was gone. In his place sat something sharper, colder, impossible to mistake. Lena followed his gaze. "Do you know him?" "Yes." "Who is he?" Someone who should not be watching this door. The cigarette ember glowed in the dark. Then the man flicked it to the sidewalk, crushed it under his heel, and walked off without once glancing back. Lena's stomach tightened, watching for what? Dominic looked at her, then really looked, and whatever answer he might have given seemed to die before it reached his mouth. Instead, he said, "Lock up earlier tomorrow." Her pulse jumped. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I am giving you tonight." She hated how quickly fear sharpened into anger. "You do not get to come in here night after night, sit in that chair, tell me pieces of your life, and then decide I can handle only the parts you choose." His gaze held hers. "I am deciding what reaches your door. It already has." The truth of it flashed between them, hot and undeniable. It had reached her the first night he knocked. It had reached her in whispers from the television and worried looks from Ivy, and the way Mr. Delaney paused too long over his coffee when Dominic's name came up. It had reached her in the strange ache of wanting to know what happened to his bruised hand, and hating herself for wanting it. Dominic rose from the chair. He was close now. Too close for comfort, too close for anything except honesty. Lena could smell rain on his coat and coffee on his breath. Could see the weariness around his eyes and the disciplined control holding every part of him still. "You should be furious with me," he said. "I am. That is not all you are." No, it was not. She hated that he knew. His hand came up slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She did not. His fingers hovered near her cheek, not touching, asking something without words. "Tell me to leave," he said. Her throat tightened. Every practical part of her screamed to do exactly that. Tell him to go. Lock the door. Turn off the lights. Choose the life she understood over the one that had begun to pulse beneath her skin every time midnight came. But the truth had already ruined simpler choices. She looked at him and saw the man from the headlines, yes. The man whose name made people lower their voices. The man who moved through danger as if it were native air. But she also saw the one who held a chipped blue mug with both hands like warmth mattered. The one who asked about her mother's chalkboard drawings. The one who had said yes when she asked if he was tired of being feared. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "If I wanted you gone, I would not keep opening the door." Something broke open in his expression, then not dramatically, not with grand relief, but in the subtle, devastating way ice breaks under the first real thaw. His fingertips touched her face. The contact was almost nothing, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, yet it sent a spark through her so sudden she forgot how to breathe. "You do not know what you are doing to me," he said. "Then tell me." His thumb moved once, barely brushing her skin. "In your cafe, I remember what it is like not to be armed against everything." The confession wrapped around her ribs and held tight. Lena lifted a hand before she could stop herself. Her fingers caught the lapel of his coat, then slid upward to the edge of his collar, where rain had left the wool cool. She felt the controlled rise and fall of his breath, saw the way his eyes dropped to her mouth and back again. The city outside seemed to fall away. No tires, no rain, no clock. Just the old cafe, the smell of espresso and damp wool, and the impossible gravity pulling them closer. "You scare me," she whispered. His jaw tightened. "You should be scared. But not of this." The words were out before she could pull them back. His hand moved to the side of her neck, warm and steady, as if he were holding something breakable and already knew it might cut him. "No," he said quietly. "Not of this." Then he kissed her, not like a man taking, like a man who had held himself rigid for too long and finally let want speak before caution could silence it. His mouth was warm, careful at first, then hungrier when she leaned into him instead of away. Lena's fingers closed in the fabric at his shoulder. The kiss deepened with a kind of stunned urgency, as though both of them had crossed into something they had already felt coming and still were not prepared for. His other hand came to her waist. Hers slid up into his hair, damp at the edges from rain. Every nerve in her body lit at once. The cafe around them remained heartbreakingly ordinary. The glass case with 2 croissants, the chalkboard menu, the stack of clean mugs by the sink. Yet the kiss changed the room more completely than fire could have. It turned everything before it into a border they had stepped across without speaking. When they finally pulled apart, both of them stayed close, breathing the same air. Dominic rested his forehead lightly against hers. For the first time since she had met him, his composure looked shaken. This, he said, voice rough, is where it becomes dangerous. Lena kept her eyes closed for one beat longer, trying to quiet the storm he had set off in her chest. When she opened them, the blue of his gaze looked darker in the low light. Maybe it already was. Something like pain passed over his face. Not regret. The recognition of cost. Outside, headlights crawled slowly past the window and then stopped for half a second too long at the curb. Dominic turned his head immediately, every instinct in him sharpening. The car moved on. His arm tightened once around her waist before he let go. I should leave. The words hit her with unreasonable force. Do you want to? Number. The honesty of it nearly undid her again. But he stepped back anyway, drawing that invisible line back into place with obvious effort. Lena felt the loss of his warmth before she had even fully let go. He reached for the blue mug still sitting abandoned on the counter and turned it once between his fingers. Keep this one for me. She swallowed. That sounds presumptuous. It is. A small, helpless laugh escaped her. He looked at her for a long moment, the fierce brightness gone from his face, now replaced by something quieter, and in some ways more dangerous. Go upstairs as soon as I leave, he said. There you go again. Lena. The way he said her name stopped her. Not commanding, not cold, pleading without letting the word become soft. She crossed her arms, partly to steady herself. You do not get to kiss me, and then talk to me like I am a problem to be managed. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, then returned to her eyes. I am talking to you like you are the only thing in this room I cannot afford to misjudge. That left her with no answer. He moved to the door and paused with his hand on the lock. Rain whispered against the glass. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked, probably Ivy pacing in her room, unaware that the shape of Lena's life had just shifted below her feet. Dominic glanced back once. There were 100 things she could have said. Do not come back. Come back tomorrow. Tell me who was across the street. Tell me what happens now. Tell me why it feels like I have known you longer than a handful of nights. What came out instead was be careful. His expression changed with almost unbearable subtlety. You too, he said. Then he was gone. The bell above the door gave its soft note and settled. Lena locked the cafe and stood there in the amber light with one hand pressed to her mouth as if the warmth of the kiss might still be waiting there. The room looked exactly the same. The table by the window, the register, the stack of receipts. Yet nothing in it felt untouched. After a long minute, she picked up the blue mug and carried it to the sink. She washed it carefully, dried it, and instead of returning it to the shelf with the others, she placed it alone beneath the counter where only she would know where to find it. Then she turned out the lights and climbed the stairs to the apartment above, each step sounding too loud in the midnight quiet. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her cafe clothes, staring at the rain threading down the window pane. Down in the street, a car idled, then pulled away. Somewhere in the building, Ivy coughed in her sleep. Lena touched her lips again and shut her eyes. Fear was still there. So was reason. But neither one had won. By morning, Lena had learned something cruel about crossing a line. The world did not pause to let you understand it. Boston woke up gray and restless as if the sky had never quite recovered from the rain. Delivery trucks rattled down Tremont. A cyclist cursed at a taxi in the intersection. The bakery down the block dragged metal racks onto the sidewalk and let the smell of fresh bread roll into the cold air. Inside Brooks Street, Coffee the Grinder's roared milk frothed into clouds and the front bell kept singing open and shut, while Lena moved through the rush like someone performing muscle memory inside a body she no longer fully trusted. Every ordinary thing felt sharpened. When her fingers brushed a ceramic cup, she remembered Dominic's hand at her neck. When she turned toward the window, she saw the place where the car had paused too long the night before. When the front bell chimed, something inside her lifted before reason pushed it back down. She hated that part most. Not the kiss. Not even the fear trailing after it like smoke. The waiting. Ivy noticed before noon. She had one elbow on the pastry case, tongs in hand, watching Lena pour drip coffee for a man in a Red Sox cap who had ordered the same thing every Thursday for 6 years. You are smiling at the coffee pots. Lena glanced up too fast. No, I am not. You were. I was not. Ivy slid a blueberry muffin into a paper sleeve and gave Lena a look made entirely of suspicion. That is worse. You only deny things that hard when I am right. Lena rang up the order, handed over change, and waited until the customer left before lowering her voice. Some of us are trying to keep this business running, and some of us are trying to figure out why our sister looks like she got no sleep but still does not seem tired. Lena reached for a dish towel and began wiping down the counter in tight, efficient strokes. That sentence made no sense. It made perfect sense. Mr. Delaney from his table by the window made a soft, thoughtful sound into his black coffee and kept reading his paper without lifting his head. He never missed anything. Lena would have liked him less for that if he had not reminded her so much of the regulars her father used to call the bones of the place. Ivy leaned closer. Did he come back? Lena kept wiping. You should be in school. I have early release. That does not answer my question. It also does not answer mine. Their eyes met across the register. Lena saw then that Ivy was not only curious. She was scared. Not in the dramatic way teenagers like to be scared when they mistook thrill for substance. Truly scared. The kind that pulled her shoulders tight and made her mouth go stubborn, because fear in that house had always been dressed as irritation first. Lena softened despite herself. He came by. Ivy's face changed at once. Lena. It was coffee. It is never just coffee. The truth of that sat between them harder than Lena wanted. She looked away first. Go restock the lids. Ivy did, but not, before saying under her breath, You're acting like this is something out of a movie. Lena wanted to tell her that movies were kinder. In movies, the dangerous man always arrived with music and certainty. In real life, he knocked softly, sat under warm lights, and said the exact thing your lonely heart had no business understanding. The rest of the afternoon passed under a thin layer of strain. Customers came and went. 2 women in office clothes whispered too long at the pickup counter and glanced toward the window like they expected to see someone there. A college boy with earbuds asked if the place had always stayed open this late, or if that rumor was true. Mr. Delaney lingered until nearly closing folding and unfolding his paper, as if he had not quite decided whether to say something. He finally did, standing at the register with exact change in his weathered palm. You look like your mother when she was worried. Lena took the bills from him and managed a tired smile. That is not the compliment you think it is. It is not meant as one. He tucked his paper under his arm. She used to smile harder when she thought trouble might hear her if she spoke plainly. Lena's fingers tightened around the drawer. I appreciate the concern, Mr. Delaney. He studied her for a long beat, kindness and warning mixed in the lines of his face. I know you do. That is what worries me. When he left, the cafe felt larger and emptier at once. By evening, the wind picked up. Ivy went upstairs after helping Lena close, but this time she paused halfway to the stairs and looked back. If he comes tonight, I want you to remember something. Lena locked the till. What? Ivy held the railing, 17 and stubborn and too old now to be shielded by easy lies. You are allowed to want things. You are just not allowed to gamble both our lives on them. Then she went upstairs, leaving the words behind like broken glass. Lena stood very still. There were moments when being the older sister felt less like love and more like failing slowly in public. She had promised herself after the accident that Ivy would never have to carry what she carried. Bills fear the ache of watching a dream survive only because you refuse to let it die, even on days when you had nothing left to feed it with except exhaustion and pride. Lena had built her whole life around making sure the world stayed manageable for the 2 of them, and now Dominic Russo had placed one hand against her cheek and made the world feel too large and too dangerous to measure. He did not come that night. She told herself she was relieved. She was still awake at 1 in the morning, sitting on the edge of her bed above the cafe when she finally admitted to the dark that relief and disappointment could live in the same body and claw at each other until neither one won. The next day, Dominic's absence settled over her like a private bruise. She was angry at him for it, which felt ridiculous. He had never promised to come. He had never asked her for anything clear enough to call a promise. But by now, the ritual had carved itself into her nights. The silence where his knock should have been did not feel neutral. It felt personal. Cal appeared just after lunch. He took the stool at the counter as if it belonged to him and ordered an espresso he did not seem to need. He was in his early 30s, broad in the shoulders, with a face that might have passed for friendly if his eyes had not kept doing quiet inventory of every door, every window, every person who entered the room. Lena set the cup in front of him. "We do not have table service for men who make the room nervous." Cal glanced around. "Your room is nervous because it has good instincts." His voice was rougher than Dominic's lived-in and unsentimental. Lena crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" He picked up the tiny cup and sipped. "Mr. Russo asked me to look in. That is not what this looks like." "No," Cal said calmly. "This looks like me sitting where I can see the street." A pulse of irritation went through her. "I do not need a guard." Cal set the espresso down and looked at her fully for the first time. "Need has very little to do with it. Tell him to stop sending people into my cafe." "He did not send people. He sent me." "That is not better." One side of Cal's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "I did not say it was." He left cash on the counter and stayed for another 20 minutes reading a sports page he never turned. When he finally rose, he gave the front window a last measured glance and said, "Lock early, if you can." Lena's temper flared. "I am tired of people saying things like that and acting like it means nothing." Cal paused at the door. "It never means nothing." Then he was gone. Dominic came that night. The knock landed in Lena's chest like something remembered and resented all at once. She let him in without a word and turned back to the counter before he could see how much the sight of him had shifted the air in her lungs. He looked tired, more than tired, drawn tight in a way that made the room around him feel temporary. There was a cut high along his brow, shallow but fresh, and a faint darkening near his left cheekbone the low light could not hide. She set the blue mug on the counter harder than she meant to. "If you are going to disappear, try not to leave your shadow behind." Dominic stood on the other side of the counter taking that in. "You are angry. You noticed. I was occupied. That is a polished word for bleeding in places I cannot ask about." He reached for the mug but did not lift it. Cal came by. "I noticed." A quiet beat passed. Then he said, "He was not there to offend you." "No, he was there to remind me that your life leaks under doors." His gaze stayed on her face. "I know." Those two words held no defense. That only made it worse. Lena looked away, rearranging clean spoons in a ceramic cup she had already arranged twice. "You do not get to kiss me, and then let your men turn my cafe into a checkpoint." A flicker of something moved through his expression. Regret, perhaps. Or the exhaustion of a man watching a thing he wanted become dangerous in real time. "What happened last night," he said quietly, "should not have happened if I could protect you by staying away." She looked up at once. "Could." He rested one hand on the counter. His knuckles were still healing under the skin. "There are people who notice where I go." The room cooled around the sentence. "Who?" He held her gaze. "A man named Marcus Kane." The name meant nothing to her, but the way Dominic said it made her wish it did not exist at all. "Rival? Something older than rivalry. He sees weakness where he can use it." Lena hated the next question before she asked it. "And me?" Dominic's jaw tightened. "You are not weakness. That is not what he would call me." Silence filled the space between them, and the silence answered well enough. She felt anger rise because fear needed somewhere to go. "Then leave me out of it." He took that without flinching. "I have been trying. You have been failing." The words struck cleanly. She saw them land. He did not look away. "No," he said. "I have." For one painful second, all she wanted was to step back from the counter, from the room, from the whole impossible tangle of want and danger and tenderness she had allowed to grow here. Instead, she stood still and watched him reach into the inside pocket of his coat. Her breath caught. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her sketch. He set it down between them. The page had been pressed flat, kept carefully, not crumpled into a jacket pocket, not forgotten in a car. Kept. "I was not staying away because I changed my mind," he said. Lena stared at the drawing. Her own pencil lines looked stranger now, too intimate. "Then why?" His voice lowered. "Because for 12 hours after I left here, every decision I made was worse because all I could think about was coming back." The truth in it left her nowhere safe to stand. She looked at him and saw not the boss the city feared, not the man on the television surrounded by black vehicles and caution tape, but the one who had preserved a scrap of paper like it mattered. It would have been so much easier if he had lied more. She poured the coffee and slid it across to him. This time, when their fingers touched, neither pulled away immediately. He turned his hand beneath hers, a small motion enough for his thumb to graze her knuckles. Warmth shot up her arm with humiliating speed. "You should not do that," she whispered. "No," he said, "I should not." He moved his hand away first. That was somehow more intimate than if he had lingered. He stayed only half an hour. They did not kiss again. They spoke in low voices about ordinary things because ordinary things were all the room could bear. Ivy's final exams. A broken hinge on the back storage door. The flower buckets outside the market on Harrison Avenue. But beneath every word lived the knowledge of what now pressed at the edges of her life. The next morning, everything broke open. It was just after 9. The cafe was filling with the soft clatter of cups and commuters. Ivy was at the pastry case, hair tied up, humming under her breath while she straightened a tray of almond croissants. Lena had gone to the back room for oat milk and napkins. She was gone less than 2 minutes. When she came back, Ivy was gone. At first, her mind rejected it. The front bell had not rung. The register still sat open from the last sale. A man in a navy coat waited at the counter looking at his phone, unaware anything was wrong. "Ivy." Lena called, turning toward the restroom hallway. No answer. The man in the navy coat glanced up. "Everything okay?" Lena ignored him and moved faster, checking the supply closet, the back steps, the alley door. Empty. The hairs along her arms rose. Then she saw it. Ivy's phone on the counter. Her apron hanging from its hook. Lena's chest hollowed out in one sickening instant. Cal was already coming through the front door. He took one look at her face, one look at the abandoned phone, and his expression turned to stone. "No," Lena said before he spoke, as if the word could hold back reality if she threw it hard enough. "No." Cal crossed the room in 3 strides and checked the alley door. Locked. He looked through the front window, then at the ceiling corners, then back at the phone. His hand was already inside his jacket, reaching for his own. "Call him," Lena said, though she could barely hear her own voice. Cal was dialing before she finished. Her knees weakened. She caught the edge of the counter and gripped it hard enough to hurt. "Where is she?" Cal listened, gave an address to whoever answered, then looked at Lena with the blunt mercy of someone who knew panic wasted time but would not say so out loud. Kane. The name hit harder now. Lena shook her head once violently. Why her? Why not come through the front door and take me if that is what he wants? Cal's jaw tightened. Because he wants Mr. Russo reckless. The room began to tilt. The commuter in the navy coat had gone very still by the door, finally understanding enough to back out without his coffee. Lena did not notice him leave. All she could see was Ivy at 17, stubborn and bright and alive in the blank space where she should have been. Dominic arrived in less than 20 minutes. She heard the tires first, then the front bell slamming open hard enough to hit the wall. He walked in like the whole city had been reduced to a target. No softness, no late-night calm, no man who held warm mugs in both hands. This was the version of Dominic Russo the world had built its fear around. His coat hung open. Rain darkened the shoulders. Fury burned so cold in him it made the air feel sharp. Where? Just that one word. Cal gave him the details in clipped fragments. Camera at the corner, dead for 3 minutes. Delivery van stopped in the alley. Witness on the block saw 2 men and a girl forced into the back seat. Plates covered. Dominic listened without interrupting. His eyes moved once to Lena. That single glance nearly broke her. She went to him before she could stop herself, hands catching in the front of his coat. Bring her back. His expression changed then, only slightly but enough. The violence in it narrowed into purpose. He covered her hands with his, steadying them because she had not realized they were shaking. I will. Dominic. He leaned closer, voice low enough that only she could hear. Look at me. She did. I will bring your sister home. There was no comfort in the words. Comfort would have been thinner. This was a vow given in the language he understood best. He turned and left with Cal. The next hour dragged like a blade. Lena stayed in the cafe because she had nowhere else to place her fear. Police would bring questions she could not survive answering cleanly. Calling them without Dominic's knowledge felt like throwing Ivy into a second unknown. So she stayed where the coffee smell had gone bitter in the air, and the clock kept moving as though time had not just split open. She tried calling Ivy's phone twice anyway. It rang from the counter where it still lay. She sat, then stood, then sat again. Mr. Delaney arrived, took one look at her face, and quietly locked the front door from the inside without asking permission. He stayed near the window like an old guard from another era, saying nothing unless she needed water or remembered how to breathe. It was almost noon when the call came. Not to her. To California. He handed the phone to Dominic at the warehouse down by the seaport where Kane had chosen to wait. The building sat near the harbor behind rusted fencing and stacks of shipping pallets gone gray with salt and weather. Inside, the air smelled of oil-wet concrete and old metal. Ivy was tied to a chair in the center of the open floor, trying very hard not to let the terror on her face become the only thing anyone saw. Marcus Kane paced in a dark suit that fit too well for the place. He was handsome in the polished, empty way some men were handsome, all clean lines and dead eyes. He circled Ivy slowly, talking not to her, but around her, as if she were a message written in a language he found amusing. Your sister has expensive taste in trouble, he said. Ivy swallowed hard. You should get better hobbies. Kane smiled. That would be funny if your hands were not shaking. She hated him for noticing. Hated herself more for not being able to stop. The warehouse doors thundered open. Dominic walked in first. No rush, no shouting. Just a presence so complete the room seemed to rearrange itself around it. Cal and 2 other men moved in behind him, spreading wide. Weapons stayed low but ready. Every one of Kane's men tensed. Kane laughed softly. There he is. Dominic's gaze never left Ivy. Let her go. Straight to business. You took a child. Kane's smile thinned. I took leverage. Dominic stepped forward once. You took the wrong thing. One of Kane's men tightened his grip on the knife near Ivy's shoulder. She sucked in a breath. Dominic stopped. The restraint in that stop was more frightening than motion. Kane tilted his head. You should see your face, Russo. The city would not believe how human you can look. Dominic's voice came out quiet and lethal. Touch her again, and I will take apart every inch of your life until no one remembers you had one. For a beat, even the harbor wind seemed to pause against the broken panes. Then everything happened at once. A shot cracked from the far right catwalk. Glass burst. Cal moved. Dominic did too. Chaos tore through the warehouse in noise and splinters and shouted orders. Kane's men fired from behind crates. Dominic's men returned fire from the steel columns and stacks of old pallets. Ivy dropped her head with a cry as a bullet sparked off concrete behind her chair. Dominic crossed the floor through gunfire with terrifying certainty. One of Kane's guards lunged toward Ivy with the knife. Dominic shot him once in the chest without breaking stride. Another man came at him from the side. Cal cut him off, slamming him into a support beam hard enough to leave blood on the metal. Kane grabbed Ivy by the shoulder and hauled her partly out of the chair, using her body as cover as he backed toward a loading bay. "Stay back." Dominic stopped again. The whole room tightened around that still point. Ivy's eyes were huge, wet, furious. Dominic saw them. Something in his own face shifted. Not softer, more precise. "You do not have a way out," he said to Kane. Kane pressed the knife closer to Ivy's throat. "I have your weakness." Dominic's answer came like ice breaking. "No, you have my patience." He fired. Not at Kane. At the overhead chain hoist above the loading bay. The rusted mechanism snapped loose with a shriek of metal. Kane jerked instinctively, looking up. In that single break of focus, Ivy drove her heel down on his foot and twisted hard the way Lena had taught her years ago, when they still thought self-defense was a thing for parking lots and bad dates, not warehouses and crime bosses. Kane cursed. Dominic covered the distance in 2 strides. He hit Kane with enough force to send them both crashing into a crate. The knife skidded across the floor. Cal reached Ivy first, yanking her clear as the rest of the room dissolved into the final ugly scramble of men, realizing they were losing. When Dominic rose, Kane was on his knees, blood at the corner of his mouth, one hand clutching his ribs. For a heartbeat, it looked like Dominic might end him there. Instead, he turned away, not out of mercy, out of priority. He went straight to Ivy. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Cal had already cut the rope from her wrists. Dominic crouched in front of her, his hands unexpectedly careful. "You hurt." She shook her head, then nodded, then shook it again. "No, I do not know." His voice lowered. "You are safe." She stared at him through tears. "You came. I said I would." He helped her to her feet. By the time they returned to Brooks Street Coffee, the afternoon light had turned thin and gold at the edges. Mr. Delaney opened the locked door before the SUV fully stopped. Lena was already there running. Ivy barely had time to step inside before Lena threw her arms around her. For a few seconds there were no words, only breathless sobs and the violent relief of touch, proving what fear had been trying to erase. Ivy clung back just as hard. Lena kissed her hair, her temples, her forehead, as if each point of contact could anchor her sister more firmly to the world. "She is all right," Dominic said quietly behind them. Lena looked up. He stood just inside the door, coat open, blood on one cuff that was not all his. His face had gone pale beneath the hard control he wore like armor. Cal remained near the entrance, watchful even now. Lena eased Ivy toward the stairs where Mr. Delaney took over gently, guiding her upward with the kind steadiness age sometimes gave where youth only shook. Then Lena turned back to Dominic. The cafe held its breath around them. "You brought her home." His eyes searched her face, and for one naked moment the boss vanished again. Only the man remained. There was no other ending. Emotion rose in her too fast and too deep to manage cleanly. Gratitude, fury, fear, love, trying to become itself before she was ready to name it. She crossed the small space between them and caught his jacket in both hands, not to pull him close and not to push him away. Simply to make sure he was still standing there. He covered one of her hands with his. Warm, solid, real, and for the first time since he had knocked on her door and asked for one last coffee, Lena understood with frightening clarity that Dominic Russo was no longer only the danger at her threshold. He had become the man her heart looked for when everything else broke. That truth did not arrive gently. It settled into Lena over the next few days like smoke in fabric, impossible to shake out, impossible to ignore. Ivy slept badly. She woke at small sounds. She startled when the front bell rang too hard. She kept saying she was fine in the clipped, bright tone people used when they had no intention of letting the worst parts leave their mouths. Lena did not push. She made tea Ivy never finished. She left the hall light on at night. She moved through the cafe and the apartment above it with that familiar older sister instinct to fix what could not be fixed by hands alone. Every time Ivy went quiet at the table, Lena found some practical thing to say. Eat something. Take your sweater. Did you text Marisol back? It was easier than asking whether she still felt the rope around her wrists when she closed her eyes. The cafe changed too. No one said it plainly, but the place had become a story before the city had the facts. Customers lingered a little less. Conversations dipped when Lena passed. Twice, she caught strangers glancing at the front window, then at the table where Dominic always sat. One woman in a wool coat asked for her cappuccino to go, even though she had already taken a seat. A man in a suit lowered his voice and said into his phone, "No, I am telling you, it is that place." Mr. Delaney still came every morning at 8:15. The nurses and scrubs still stopped in on Thursdays. The law students still argued over cold brew like nothing in the world mattered as much as their own opinions. But underneath the ordinary traffic of the day, something had shifted. Brooks Street Coffee was no longer invisible, and invisibility had once been one of the few protections Lena possessed. Cal remained nearby more often now. He did not always sit inside. Sometimes Lena spotted him through the front window leaning against a dark sedan down the block, coffee cup in hand, eyes on the street. Other times, one of Dominic's other men would appear across from the flower stand or near the bakery and pretend to study his phone too long. None of them interfered with the cafe. None of them spoke unless spoken to. They were simply there, a presence woven through the day like a thread she could not pull free without unraveling something larger. Lena resented it. Lena also knew exactly why it was happening. Dominic came that night after Ivy's rescue, and the night after that. He did not stay as long. He looked at every car that slowed outside. He touched his phone more often than his coffee. Sometimes his shirt cuff was stiff where dried blood had not washed out completely. Once, there was a fresh cut beneath his jaw, thin and red as a line drawn by an impatient hand. She did not ask where each mark came from anymore. She had begun to understand that in his world, certain answers came with more weight than relief. One night, after Ivy had finally gone upstairs and the last chair had been turned over, Dominic sat at the window table with the blue mug in both hands and watched Lena lock the front door. She turned back to him. "You are quieter than usual." He gave a small glance toward the street. "I am thinking." That is never a comforting sentence when it comes from you. A faint shadow of a smile touched his mouth and vanished. It is not meant to be. She crossed to the counter and rested her palms against the worn wood. "How bad is it?" He looked at her for a long moment. The answer he gave was plain enough to make her chest tighten. Bad. No dressing it up, no careful half-truth. The heater clicked on somewhere in back. Steam fogged the lower corner of the front window. Lena stood there, the warmth of the room pressing against the cold under her skin. And Kane. Dominic's jaw shifted. He lost men. He will want the balance evened. Meaning he will keep pushing until one of us stops moving. She hated how quickly fear became anger when there was nowhere else for it to go. "You keep saying us like I agreed to be drafted." His gaze sharpened. "You did not, but here I am." Yes. The single word hung in the room. He rose then and walked around the table, not slowly, not with the deliberate caution he had used the first time he touched her, but with the quiet certainty of a man too tired to pretend distance still protected anything. He stopped in front of her and brushed his fingers lightly over her wrist where her pulse fluttered. "I know what this has cost you already." Lena looked up at him. "You do not know all of it." His hand stilled. "Then tell me." So she did, not all at once, not in one grand speech. It came in broken pieces because broken pieces were often truer than polished sentences. She told him she had not slept through a full night since Ivy was taken. That every time the front bell rang too sharply, she felt her heart slam against her ribs. That she hated the way people looked at the cafe now like it had become contaminated by proximity. That she had spent years building a life small enough to manage, and he had walked in with expensive shoes and quiet eyes and turned every boundary she trusted into smoke. Dominic took every word without defending himself. When she finished, the silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. He touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers, the gesture so gentle it hurt. "If I could move you out of this city tonight and know it would end there, I would." Lena gave a breathless, disbelieving laugh. "That sounds suspiciously like affection." His eyes darkened. Lena. There was too much in the way he said her name. Warning. Want. Something close to helplessness which looked wrong on him and therefore struck deeper. She reached for him before she thought better of it. Her hand flattened against the center of his chest over the clean white shirt beneath his coat. His heartbeat was steady. Too steady for a man who lived where he lived. "You do not get to sound like that, and then act surprised when I still open the door." His hand came over hers and held it there. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then he bent and kissed her. This time, there was less hesitation in it, less disbelief. The same hunger, yes, but also the strange tenderness that had somehow become more dangerous than desire. Lena's fingers curled into his lapel. His hand slid to the back of her neck, warm and firm, keeping her there while the cafe around them blurred into nothing but amber light and the faint, bitter sweetness of coffee gone cold on the table. When they pulled apart, she stayed close enough to feel his breath against her lips. "Stay a little longer," she whispered. He shut his eyes for one beat, as if the request had reached someplace unarmored. Then he nodded. He stayed until 1 in the morning. For 1 hour, they borrowed something almost ordinary. Lena made fresh coffee and sat with him at the window table. He loosened the knot of his tie and draped his coat over the back of the chair. She tucked one foot under herself the way her mother used to and told him about the winter the pipes burst, and her father tried to fix them with a hairdryer and absolute confidence. Dominic laughed at that, a low, real sound that changed the whole room. He told her about a dog he had wanted as a boy and never been allowed to keep because his father called pets a weakness you had to feed. She told him that was the saddest thing she had ever heard said by a rich man. He looked at her and said, "I was not rich then, only watched." The city stayed quiet outside. Inside the cafe with his tie loose and the sharp edges of him softened by fatigue and warmth, he almost looked like a man from a life she could have touched without bleeding. That illusion lasted 4 days. The fire started on a Thursday night. All day, the weather had been dry and restless, the kind of cool spring evening that made people walk slower after dinner. Business had been steady. Ivy had even really laughed at something Mr. Delaney muttered about college students and their inability to choose a muffin without consulting 3 friends and a moral framework. For a few hours, Lena let herself believe they had moved 1 inch closer to normal. By 11:30, the cafe was empty. Ivy had gone upstairs early to shower. Lena stayed below to finish the books and wipe down the counters. She moved through the closing routine and practiced order, register counted, milk put away, pastries covered, espresso machine cleaned, front windows checked, chairs up, lights dimmed. The old building sighed around her the way old buildings did at night. Pipes settling, wood easing against wood. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. A siren passed 3 streets over and kept going. Lena was in the back storage area checking inventory when she smelled it. At first it seemed out of place, sharp and chemical beneath the usual warm mix of beans and sugar and soap. Then came the heat. She turned. Orange light crawled along the lower wall near the stacked syrup boxes. For one stupid suspended second her mind rejected the image. Fire belonged in fireplaces and candles, and the controlled blue flame under a metal pot. It did not belong on the wall behind the reserve stock of vanilla syrup and paper sleeves. Then the flames jumped. The sound they made was worse than the sight. A sudden, hungry rush paper catching heat licking upward with terrifying speed. Lena grabbed the extinguisher from beside the back door and yanked the pin free. White spray burst across the nearest flames, choking the air. For a moment it seemed to work. Then something deeper caught something fed. The fire rolled along the shelf line and surged higher. Number. She backed up, coughing one forearm over her mouth. Smoke thickened at once, dark and fast. The ceiling above the storage room glowed with reflected orange. She dropped the empty extinguisher and ran for the front. The heat hit her across the open cafe like an opened oven door the size of a wall. Somewhere behind her, glass shattered. She reached the counter, grabbed her phone, then heard a crack overhead so violent it froze her where she stood. A beam near the back groaned. Upstairs, Ivy. Lena spun toward the rear hall and ran for the stairs, smoke pouring after her. Halfway there, she heard footsteps pounding above and Ivy's voice screaming her name. Relief nearly buckled her knees. "Front door," Lena shouted. Ivy appeared at the top landing with wet hair and no shoes, eyes wide in the spreading gray. She took one look down into the cafe and started coughing. Together they stumbled toward the front. Another crash split the room. A fixture dropped somewhere behind the counter in a rain of sparks. Heat shoved at their backs. By the time Lena reached the door, her hands were shaking so hard she missed the lock once before getting it open. Cold night air slammed into them. They stumbled onto the sidewalk just as flames blew against the inside of the front windows. Ivy doubled over, coughing. Lena dragged her farther from the entrance, turned and saw the neon sign reflected in fire. For 1 second, she simply stared. Brooks Street Coffee, the place her parents had built from second-hand equipment and impossible optimism. The place where her mother taped handwritten thank-you notes from regulars inside the cabinet doors, because she said good words should live near the cups. The place that had fed them, carried them, exhausted them, and kept them from sinking after everything else had fallen away. Burning. Neighbors shouted. Someone called 911. A man from the bakery came running with a fire blanket that could never have mattered against flames like that. Windows on the upper floors opened. People gathered in slippers and coats, and frightened silence. Lena heard none of it clearly. The sound in her head had become a roar. Then a black SUV braked hard at the curb. Dominic was out of it before the engine fully died. He crossed the sidewalk in 3 long strides, his face changing as he took in the fire, the smoke, Lena on her knees in the street with soot on her skin, and terror hollowing her eyes. He dropped beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head once then again, because she did not know. "Ivy." "I am here." Ivy coughed beside them, clutching the fire blanket around her shoulders. Dominic looked at both sisters, then at the building, then back at Lena. And in that instant he knew. This was him, she whispered. Not a question. Dominic's jaw locked. The fury in him did not explode. It concentrated. That was somehow worse. He helped Ivy to the curb, where Cal, newly arrived, took over and wrapped her in another blanket. Then Dominic came back to Lena. The flames had eaten through the back half of the cafe now. Firefighters were arriving, shouting, dragging hoses, the night filling with flashing red light and the hiss of water under pressure. But Lena could only see the shape of loss. "It is gone," she said. Dominic crouched in front of her and took her face carefully in both hands, heedless of soot of ash of the watching street. "Number." Her eyes burned. "Dominic, look at it." "I am looking at you." That nearly broke what little remained holding her upright. Tears spilled hot and immediate. Everything they built, everything I kept alive. I could not save it. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers as if grounding them both against the chaos around them. "You are not walls and tables. That is easy for you to say." "No." His voice roughened. "It is not." She looked into his eyes and saw something raw there, something stripped of power and polish and all the names the city gave him. He knew what it was to watch a thing you could not replace burn out in front of you. Maybe that was why he did not offer false comfort. He only held the truth as steadily as he could. "We will build it again." The certainty in the words would have sounded arrogant from almost anyone else. From him kneeling in ash and flashing light, it sounded like a vow laid down at the feet of her grief. Lena cried then in earnest, not quietly, not gracefully. Years of exhaustion and fear and love for a place made out of labor and memory came apart all at once. Dominic pulled her against him and let her. He stood in the street holding her while the fire tore through the heart of the life she knew. and the city watched from a distance it liked to call sympathy. The next morning, the cafe was a ruin. The roof at the back had partially collapsed. The front windows were gone. Water ran black through the doorway. The chalkboard menu had survived only as a blistered, dark shape on the wall. The smell was the worst part. Wet ash, melted plastic, burned wood, ruined sweetness. A scent that told the body something beloved had changed beyond recognition. Lena stood on the sidewalk with Ivy and stared. Ivy slipped her hand into hers without a word. By noon, the neighbors began arriving. First, the man from the bakery with coffee in a cardboard tray, because some instincts outlived disaster. Then the owner of the flower stand with 3 buckets of cheap carnations she said were not right for funerals, and not right for celebrations, but maybe right for surviving. Then 2 nurses from Thursday mornings carrying envelopes of cash collected from hospital staff. Then Mr. Delaney with old photos he had taken over the years of the cafe front at Christmas and snow and summer, under paper lanterns the night Lena's father turned 60, and insisted he was still a handsome menace to women and espresso machines alike. People came with hammers, gloves, tarps, casseroles, folding chairs, paint catalogs, business cards, and stories. Lena had not known until then how many lives the place had quietly touched. She listened to them, one by one, while standing in the shell of what remained. Your mother once sat with me 3 hours after my divorce because I could not stop crying into my coffee. Your dad gave my son his first job washing dishes. I wrote half my thesis at that corner table. You kept the lights on during the blizzard when half the block lost power. Every story laid another piece of the place back in her hands. Dominic did not merely send money. He came the second morning in worn boots and a dark sweater instead of a suit. He rolled up his sleeves and started hauling out charred lumber with his own hands. Cal was there too, and 2 other men from his world who looked vaguely stunned the first time Mr. Delaney barked at them for stacking salvaged chairs like amateurs. Lena watched Dominic shoulder a burned support beam and carry it through the gutted doorway as if brute strength might answer grief. Soot streaked his forearms. Dust clung to his hair. For all his money, all his reputation, all the distance power usually built around him, he worked like a man trying to earn the right to stand there. That was what undid her, not the grand vow on the night of the fire. This, Dominic in ash and sunlight lifting ruined wood from the bones of her family's dream. One evening, when most of the volunteers had gone, and the late light turned the street amber, she found him in the doorway, fitting a new hinge to a temporary frame where the back storage door had been. You do realize, she said leaning against the scorched brick, that if anyone in this city saw you right now, your image would never recover. He glanced up. His face was smudged tired and unbearably handsome in the way labor made certain men look less distant. Then I trust you to protect my reputation. She nearly smiled, nearly. The shadow returned as quickly as it had lifted. He is still hitting your businesses. Dominic looked back at the hinge. Yes. And you are still answering. Yes. The screwdriver in his hand stilled. He did not look at her when he said the next words. I keep hoping he will run out of nerve before I run out of restraint. Lena stepped closer. And if he does not, this time Dominic did look at her. The fading light caught the bruising still yellowing beneath one cheekbone. There was no softness in his answer. Then I ended. They stood there in the half-rebuilt doorway, while the city moved around them, and the smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with the ghost of smoke still clinging to the walls. Lena's throat tightened. I do not want revenge. This is not about revenge. Then what is it? His voice dropped low and certain. Survival. The word entered her like cold water, because she knew he meant it. Not in the theatrical way people in stories promised blood under moonlight and soft music. In the practical, brutal way men like Dominic understood endings. Marcus Kane would keep coming. At the cafe, at Ivy, at anyone who could be turned into leverage. The fire had settled that. A week later, Dominic came to Brook Street late with blood on his shirt. Not much. Enough. The temporary counter was in place by then, though the cafe would not reopen for weeks. Ivy had gone upstairs early after painting sample colors for the new wall behind the pastry case. Lena was alone below pricing replacement equipment by the light of a desk lamp when the knock came. She opened the door, and every word in her body turned to ice. Jesus. Dominic stepped inside and closed the door behind him before she could call out. It is not mine. That is not comforting. He looked pale beneath the strain that held him upright. There was a split along his brow and a bruise forming at the edge of his throat where a collar might hide it if he bothered trying. Lena guided him to one of the salvaged chairs and went for the first aid kit without asking permission. When she came back, he sat with his forearms on his knees, head lowered for the first time since she had known him, like the weight had finally become visible. She knelt in front of him and pressed clean gauze to the cut above his eye. He winced. You are enjoying this. I am considering charging you for after-hours trauma care. That sounds expensive. It should. Her voice trembled on the last word anyway. He caught her wrist lightly, stilling the hand with the gauze. Lena. She met his eyes and the fear broke through. You are going to get yourself killed. The words filled the unfinished room and did not echo because they were too true. Dominic's expression changed, not surprised, just pained that she had to say it aloud. If that was easy, he said, I would have done it years ago. That is not funny. I was not making a joke. Her eyes burned. I do not want your blood buying us safety. I want you alive. Something fierce and helpless moved across his face. He rose from the chair and pulled her to her feet with him. The unfinished café, all exposed studs and stacked tile boxes and dust caught in lamplight seemed to narrow around them. You think I do not know that. His hand came to the side of her face. You think I do not hear that every time I leave you. Then stop leaving like you are walking toward a grave. For one beat, he simply looked at her. Then he touched his forehead to hers, a gesture that had become more intimate than any kiss because it asked for no audience and no heat, only truth. I cannot let him keep reaching this door. Lena closed her eyes. Dominic. He kissed her then, slow and aching, his hand at her waist, hers gripping the back of his sweater, as if holding on hard enough might change the shape of fate. When he drew back, his voice was almost a whisper. I finished this. She knew better than to ask him not to. The fire, the kidnapping, the men, watching from cars outside her home. They had all already answered that plea before she could speak it, so instead she placed her hand flat against his chest and said the only thing left that mattered. Come back. He held her there a moment longer, looking at her like he was committing every line of her face to memory. Always, he said. Whether it was promise or prayer, she could not tell. After Dominic left that night, the unfinished café seemed too quiet to hold all the fear he had taken with him. Lena stood in the middle of the stripped floorboards and listened to the building settle around her. The new support beams smelled of raw wood. Dust floated in the lamplight. Upstairs, Ivy turned once in her bed and then went still again. Lena did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold between her hands and watched the dark window over the sink until dawn thinned the glass from black to gray. Every passing car made her pulse jump. Every siren stitched another line of tension through her back. Twice she reached for her phone. Twice she stopped. There was nothing she could say to a man walking into violence except the one thing she had already said. Come back. By morning, Boston looked scrubbed clean by the night air, but nothing inside her felt clean. The city moved with its usual indifference. Commuters rushed past the café without knowing the shape of her panic. A man walked a golden retriever under the weak spring sun. A bus sighed to a stop at the corner. The bakery down the block rolled out fresh bread and let the smell of yeast and butter drift into the street. Inside the half-rebuilt shell of Brooks Street Coffee, Lena stood behind the temporary counter and tried to sort invoices for replacement equipment. Her eyes moved over the numbers without holding them. Ivy came downstairs in an oversized sweater and socks, hair still sleep-flattened on one side, and stopped when she saw Lena. You were up all night. Lena looked at the papers in front of her. No. Ivy gave her a long, tired look. You do realize I know what your lying face looks like. The words were meant to be light. They landed softly anyway. Since the kidnapping, Ivy had become careful with certain tones, as if she had discovered how fragile ordinary moments could be and wanted to spare them where she could. Lena put the invoices down. Did you sleep? Not really. Ivy came around the counter and perched on one of the salvaged stools. The morning light found the faint yellowing bruise along her wrist where the rope had rubbed raw days earlier. Lena had stopped staring at it because staring made the memory too present, but she still saw it every time. Neither sister spoke for a moment. Then Ivy said quietly, "He went, didn't he?" Lena did not ask who she meant. Yes. To end it. Another lie rose and died in her throat. Yes. Ivy lowered her gaze to her hands. Do you think he will? Lena knew what the unfinished question meant. Not whether Dominic would win. Whether he would come back with enough of himself left to still be the man who drank coffee at her window table and listened to her talk about broken hinges and overripe peaches at the Sunday market, as if none of it were small. I do not know, she said. It was the truth. It also felt like a betrayal. Ivy looked up, then more serious than any 17-year-old should have had to be. He came for me. Lena's breath caught. I know. The words came out rough. No, Ivy said. I mean, I know what he is. I know what people say. I know what he probably has done. But he came for me. Her voice shook on the last part, not from uncertainty, but from the force of remembering. He did not have to make that the first thing. He could have gone after Kane. He could have made a point. He did not. Lena stared at her sister and saw that the fear had changed something in her, sharpened it. Children believed in simple categories longer than adults did. Good people, bad people, safe choices, dangerous men. The world had reached into Ivy's life and scattered all of that across a warehouse floor. He is not simple, Lena whispered. No, Ivy said. Neither are you. That hurt because it felt true. By noon, there was still no word. Cal had sent one message just after sunrise. Working, no details, no comfort. It was exactly the kind of message Cal would send, and Lena hated him for being the kind of man who knew that was the most anyone could ask for. Mr. Delaney arrived with his usual newspaper tucked under one arm and stopped when he saw Lena's face. That bad. She tried for a smile and failed. You should not ask questions you know the answer to. He set the paper down on the temporary counter and looked around the gutted room, where fresh paint samples leaned against the wall and unopened tile boxes were stacked near the old pastry case frame. Your father used to get this look when the pipes froze, and he had to pretend to your mother that he knew exactly what he was doing. Lena let out a breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. He never did. Number. Mr. Delaney rested one weathered hand on the counter, but pretending bought him time until the right help arrived. She understood then what he was offering. Not advice. Presence. The old man settled onto a folding chair near the window and unfolded his paper as if he had every intention of sitting there as long as needed. The day stretched. At 3 in the afternoon, the sun shifted and painted a band of weak gold across the floor. At 4, the flower stand owner dropped off cuttings for the new front planters and stood talking with Ivy about what would survive best in the shade. At 5, the bakery sent over soup none of them tasted. At 6, Lena's phone remained silent. At 7, headlights washed over the temporary plywood covering the front opening. A black SUV stopped at the curb. Lena was moving before the engine cut. She ran down the short front step into the evening air just as Dominic got out. For one terrible heartbeat, all she saw was blood. A dark stain along the side of his shirt. More at one cuff. Dirt on his coat. His mouth set in a line too controlled to be safe. Then he lifted his eyes to her and she knew he was standing under his own strength. He was alive. The relief was so violent it left her dizzy. Lena reached him on the sidewalk and caught at the front of his coat with both hands, as if she needed proof from fabric and bone. He let her. One of his hands came up slowly to the back of her neck, grounding them both. You are hurt. It is handled. She drew back enough to see his face. There was fresh bruising under one cheekbone and a cut along his temple, but his gaze was clear. Clear and exhausted, and carrying something else too. Finality. Lena searched his expression. Kane. Dominic held her eyes. He is gone. The street noise fell away. Gone could mean many things in many lives. In his, it meant one thing only. She should have felt triumph, safety, some clean version of relief. Instead, what moved through her was more complicated and heavier. An end had been reached. Ends always cost something. Dominic seemed to see the thought cross her face. His thumb brushed once beneath her ear. "I know," he said quietly. She nodded because there was nothing else to do with the shape of what had happened. Then she looked past him. Cal was stepping out of the SUV, favoring one leg but upright. Another of Dominic's men remained in the driver's seat, face pale, arm bandaged. The air around all of them smelled faintly of harbor wind and cordite, and the inside of a night no one would ever describe cleanly. Ivy appeared in the doorway behind Lena, taking in Dominic and Cal and the marks they carried. Dominic's attention shifted to her immediately. "You all right, kid?" Ivy gave a small nod. "Are you?" Cal let out the briefest, rough sound that might have been a laugh. Dominic's mouth moved by half a degree. Still standing. Mr. Delaney, from somewhere behind the temporary counter, said, "Well, that is as close to celebration as this place gets before 8 in the evening." That broke something open in the tension. Not enough to make the day gentle. Enough to let people breathe. Dominic stayed only 10 minutes. Lena wanted to ask him to stay longer. To sit. To let her clean the cut at his temple. To tell her what happened at the freight terminal by the harbor, where men like him took endings into their own hands. But one look at his face told her the weight of the day had not finished with him yet. At the door, she caught his wrist. When? He understood what she meant. When would he come back as himself, not as the man still half inside the last violent hour? "Tomorrow night," he said. "Promise." His gaze softened in that dangerous private way it did only with her. Yes. Then he left, and this time when the SUV drove off, Lena did not hear threat in the sound. Only distance. The city changed quickly after that, not visibly all at once. Not with headlines anyone trusted, or public statements from men who had spent their lives avoiding cameras unless forced. But whispers shifted, the names that moved under breath in bars, private dining rooms, loading docks, and expensive back offices changed direction. Marcus Kane stopped appearing in those sentences. Dominic Russo remained, but now there was no rival answer rising beside him. The men who had watched from cars outside Brook Street Coffee stopped coming by the end of the week. Cal still checked in sometimes, though now he came inside, drank the espresso Lena made him, and complained that she brewed it like she was trying to prove a point. She told him she was. He said that tracked. The rebuilding quickened. Without Kane's pressure grinding at every hour, Dominic's attention shifted fully to the cafe. He came in the mornings in shirt sleeves and work boots, carrying lumber over one shoulder, blueprint rolls under one arm, coffee in his other hand, because he claimed construction planning required caffeine, and she had yet to meet evidence against that position. Lena saw another version of him in those weeks. Not softer exactly, but less divided. He argued with electricians over wiring routes, and then spent 20 minutes holding a tape measure while Ivy debated mural spacing across the west wall. He replaced the front door frame with the focus of a surgeon, and then stood in the alley eating bakery croissants from a paper bag, because Lena made him take a break. Once she found him crouched on the floor beside Mr. Delaney, discussing whether the old cafe clock should be restored or retired. Mr. Delaney believed restoring old things was a moral duty. Dominic believed the clock had lied about the time for 18 years and should be punished accordingly. Lena had laughed hard enough to lean against a stack of tile boxes for support. That sound stopped him in the middle of whatever he had been saying. He turned and looked at her as if laughter were rarer than gunfire. The realization struck her then with quiet force. She had seen him furious, bloodied, tender, frightening, tired. She had seen him kneeling in ash and standing in violence. But this standing in morning light with sawdust on his sleeve and surprise caught warm in his face because she had laughed might have been the most intimate thing yet. The cafe reopened in early summer. The morning they took the paper off the front windows and hung the sign back in place, the whole block seemed to breathe with them. Brooks Street Coffee looked both familiar and reborn. The brick had been cleaned and repointed where the smoke had blackened it worst. New glass gleamed in the windows. The floor inside was restored oak warmer than before. Ivy's mural along the west wall rose in deep blues, amber golds, and soft gray city lines steam curling above painted mugs like memory made visible. Behind the counter, the shelves were rebuilt, the pastry case brighter, the menu board rewritten in Lena's own hand with the exact same loops her mother taught her when she was 15 and too impatient to care about spacing. People lined up before the doors opened. The nurses and scrubs came first, still on Thursdays even though it was Monday because they claimed crisis had rewritten the week. The law students returned with strong opinions and weak wallets. The man in the Red Sox cap took his usual drip coffee and stared around at the new room before saying, "Looks like itself." The owner of the flower stand delivered peonies for the front jars and kissed Lena on both cheeks. Mr. Delaney sat at his old table by the window and drank black coffee with an expression so close to peace it felt indecent to interrupt. Dominic did not come during the rush. He knew better than to turn the reopening into a spectacle. But around 4 in the afternoon, when the line had thinned and the sunlight slanted honey-colored across the floor, he stepped inside wearing a dark suit again for the first time in weeks. The room noticed him. Of course it did. Conversations dipped. A few people looked away too quickly. Others stared. Lena looked up from the register and forgot for 1 second how to move. He crossed to the counter like any customer. "What can I get you?" she asked. Because some rituals deserved respect. One corner of his mouth lifted. One last coffee. Mr. Delaney made a satisfied sound into his newspaper. Ivy rolled her eyes so hard Lena could feel it from across the room. Lena took down the chipped blue mug from beneath the counter where she had kept it hidden all this time. She set it in front of Dominic and poured the coffee herself. The sight of that old mug in the new room changed something for everyone who understood enough to see it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Dominic paid, took the cup, and sat at the window table as if he had never sat anywhere else in the world. By closing time, the cafe smelled like fresh beans, sugar-clean wood, and the kind of relief that made people gentle without warning. Ivy finished counting pastries and announced she was going upstairs before Lena found another task to avoid being alone with her own thoughts. Mr. Delaney lingered an extra 5 minutes and then rose with the slow, deliberate dignity of a man who knew how to leave a room at the right moment. At last, the front door locked. The sign flipped to closed. Lena turned the final chair onto the last table and looked over at Dominic, still sitting by the window hands, around the blue mug city light moving in soft reflections across the glass behind him. "You know," she said, walking toward him, "most people do not need an invitation anymore once they have rebuilt half the place." He set the cup down and leaned back slightly in the chair. "Maybe I like asking. Maybe you like the answer." "I do." She stopped beside his table. The room glowed around them, warmer than night, quieter than grief. Dominic looked up at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Then he stood and reached into his coat. Lena's breath stalled. What he brought out was not a phone, not keys. A small velvet box, dark and simple in his hand. For the first time since she had met him, true nerves flickered across his face. It was not fear. Dominic Russo did not look like a man who feared outcomes. It was something rarer. Vulnerability perhaps caught in the act of becoming real. "Dominic." He stepped closer. "Most of my life," he said, "I believed power was the only thing that kept a man standing." His voice was low, steady, but she heard everything moving beneath it. "Then I walked into your cafe and asked for something small because I did not know how to ask for what I actually needed." Lena's eyes stung at once. He opened the box. Inside was a ring of understated elegance, the stone catching the cafe light without flaunting it. It was not showy, not built for strangers. It looked chosen with more care than spectacle. "You gave me a place where I was not measured by fear first," he said. "You gave your sister back her courage. You gave this room back its heart after fire tried to take it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, you gave me a life I want more than the one I was born into." Tears blurred the edges of the room. Lena laughed softly through them because if she did not laugh, she might break open completely before he finished speaking. Dominic's gaze never left hers. "I do not want one last coffee," he said. "I want every one after this with you." The words settled around her like the final piece of something long in the making. "Marry me, Lena." There are moments when time slows enough for a person to feel each beat as if it is being placed carefully into their hands. Lena felt the old wood floor under her shoes, the faint scent of cinnamon in the room, the city moving beyond the windows, the mural ivy painted, the rebuilt shelves, the blue mug cooling on the table, the man in front of her, once only danger at her door, now asking for the one thing he could not order by threaten or take. "Ein sortia." "Yes," she whispered. His shoulders moved with the exhale he had been holding. She smiled through tears. Yes. Dominic's hands were steady in almost every circumstance she had ever seen. They were not perfectly steady now as he slid the ring onto her finger. Lena looked down once, then back up at him, and whatever she saw in her face made something unguarded appear in his. She reached for him and he pulled her close. The kiss he gave her then was not hungry like the first one, not desperate like the one stolen between fear and unfinished walls. It was full, certain, the kind of kiss that knew exactly what it was choosing. When they parted, Lena rested her forehead against his. "You still have terrible timing." He gave a quiet laugh. "And yet you keep opening the door." Upstairs, Ivy let out an unmistakable shriek of delighted outrage, followed by the pounding of feet on the stairs. Dominic closed his eyes briefly as if preparing for impact. Lena started laughing before her sister even reached the bottom step. Ivy threw herself at Lena first, then hugged Dominic too, which startled him just enough to be worth every difficult thing the year had held. Mr. Delaney, who turned out not to have gone far at all, knocked once on the window, raised a paper cup in salute, and kept walking with the deep satisfaction of a man who had been right about everything and intended to be graceful about it. From then on, the ritual remained. Not because it was necessary, because some beginnings deserved to be remembered in the exact shape they first arrived. Every night, Lena closed the cafe the same way. Chairs up, counter wiped, cash counted, sign turned. And some nights, just after the last light in the street softened and the city settled into its midnight pulse, there came 3 soft knocks on the glass. Dominic, whether in a suit or shirt sleeves, whether tired from the day or smiling before she opened the door, always waited for her to let him in. She always did. He would sit at the window table. She would pour coffee into the chipped blue mug she never gave to anyone else. Sometimes they talked about nothing larger than bakery orders, Ivy's latest mural idea, or whether the basil plant by the register would finally admit defeat. Sometimes they said almost nothing at all. The quiet no longer needed defending. Outside, Boston kept all its old habits. Rain on brick, taxis in the night, the distant cry of a siren, the harbor wind moving cold through the dark streets. Inside Brook Street Coffee, the lights stayed warm, and every time Lena looked across the room at the man who once arrived like a threat and stayed like a promise, she remembered that some people did not save your life by making it easier. Some saved it by walking into the fire with you, then staying long enough to rebuild what remained.